The Zillarans were a peaceful alien species, unlike any other in their corner of the galaxy. Their planet Zelaria was a world of breathtaking beauty. Vast oceans shimmered under twin suns, towering crystal forests reflected sunlight in dazzling colors, and rolling plains stretched as far as the eye could see. The Zillarans themselves were tall and slender, with translucent skin that shimmered faintly in the light, and large, expressive eyes that conveyed emotions with astonishing clarity. From a distance, they looked delicate and fragile, and many neighboring civilizations underestimated them, assuming they could not survive serious conflict. Yet appearances were deceiving. The Zillarans possessed advanced technology and remarkable intelligence, but their nature was not to fight, it was to negotiate, to find harmony, to solve problems through communication rather than violence. For centuries, the Zillarans had built a network of trade and diplomacy. Their starships were designed more for exploration and transport than war. They had ambassadors in nearly every neighboring system, and they prided themselves on their ability to maintain peace even when tensions ran high. Their capital, Luminara, floated on a cluster of artificial platforms above the planet's largest ocean, connected by graceful bridges of light and crystal. It was a city of elegance, innovation, and serenity, filled with halls where scholars debated philosophy, scientists conducted experiments that could benefit all civilizations, and artists created works that expressed the deepest mysteries of existence. To the Zillarans, life was meant to be lived with beauty, knowledge, and understanding. They had no desire for war, and they hoped that no one else would either. Yet the galaxy beyond Zelaria was not always a friendly place. Rumors had spread of the Vokari, a fearsome empire whose ships swept through systems, consuming resources, enslaving populations, and leaving devastation in their wake. The Vokari were ruthless and technologically advanced, with fleets that could crush most defenses in a single strike. Many civilizations had already fallen to them, some disappearing completely, their systems becoming nothing more than radioactive wastelands. The Zillarans had heard stories from travelers and refugees who barely escaped the Vokari, but because of their commitment to diplomacy and peace, they had managed to avoid direct conflict until now. The Zillarans had sent envoys to neighboring civilizations, asking for alliances and protection in case the Vokar advanced into their sector. But most of these civilizations looked at Zelaria and saw a world that was rich but strategically unimportant. They weighed the risk of angering the Vokari against the potential benefits of helping the Zillarans, and concluded it was not worth their effort. Some claimed their fleets were stretched too thin. Others argued that the Zillarans should learn to defend themselves. In the background of the galaxy's vast political landscape, the Zillarans became a sort of forgotten species, admired for their beauty and intellect but left vulnerable when it mattered most. Meanwhile, far from the Zillarans' serene world, the Deathworlders patrolled the edges of known space. They came from a planet called Tariq Prime, a world that earned its name because nothing that lived there could survive without extraordinary strength, cunning, and resilience. The Deathworlders themselves were shaped by this harsh environment. Their bodies were muscular and resilient, able to endure extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, and aggressive predators. Their minds were equally formidable, honed by necessity to solve impossible problems and survive situations most species would consider fatal. They were warriors by nature but also disciplined, intelligent, and capable of surprising acts of honor and compassion, though few outside their species ever realized it. They had a reputation that preceded them, terrifying in combat, relentless in pursuit, yet surprisingly fair to those they chose to help. The Zillarans knew nothing of the Deathworld, just as most civilizations didn't. They were preoccupied with the growing threat of the Vokari, unaware that somewhere in the galaxy an unpredictable variable existed that could change everything. The Deathworlders did not operate like ordinary forces. They did not form alliances lightly, and they did not intervene in conflicts without reason. Yet there was a code that governed their actions. They aided those who showed potential for courage, intelligence, or moral worth, even if that potential had yet to be realized. It was this code that would eventually bring them into the Zillaran story. Life on Zelaria continued as usual, but a shadow was growing on the horizon. Scouts reported strange energy signatures near their system, large ships moving faster than previously recorded, leaving a faint trail of destruction in the wake of their path. Panic was subtle at first. The Zillarans, being peaceful, had never developed the culture of constant vigilance that many other species took for granted. Children played in the crystal forests without fear. Scholars debated the future of interstellar trade, and the ruling council met to discuss matters of governance, unaware that time was running out. Still, the leaders could feel unease in the atmosphere. Something in the universe had shifted, a sense that change was coming, that their world was no longer as safe as it had always been. Within the council chambers of Luminara, discussions grew tense. Elders argued that seeking help from the galaxy might provoke the Vokari to strike sooner, while younger members insisted that waiting was suicidal. The debate was heated, with emotions rising and falling like the tides beneath the floating city. They knew that Zalaria's technology, while advanced in research, culture, and energy efficiency, was untested in true warfare. Their defenses could repel small attacks, but a fleet like the Vokaris could easily overwhelm them. It was a grim realization, yet one that few were willing to accept fully. Hope, as always, clung to them, fragile but persistent. The Zillerans had relied on intelligence and diplomacy for so long that the thought of preparing for war seemed almost alien. Starships designed for exploration were being retrofitted for combat. Academies that trained scientists began producing military tech, and even the arts once focused on beauty and expression started reflecting themes of struggle and resistance. Despite these efforts, there was an undercurrent of fear. No matter how advanced their technology or brilliant their minds, they were fundamentally untested in war. And in the galaxy beyond, experience often mattered more than potential. It was during this time of quiet preparation that the first faint signals from the Deathworlders appeared, not to the Zillerans directly, but intercepted by distant scanners. Their fleets were moving through uncharted space, silently, with purpose. These signals were cryptic, nearly unnoticeable, and most species would have ignored them. But for the careful eyes of the Zillerans, scanning for any anomaly in the universe that might indicate hope or danger. The signal was a curiosity, a small flicker of possibility that someone, somewhere, might answer their desperate calls. At the time, they did not understand the significance. They only knew that the galaxy was larger and stranger than they had imagined, full of mysteries both terrifying and wondrous. Meanwhile, on Zelaria, life carried on with a strange mix of normalcy and dread. Markets still buzzed with activity, and children laughed in the gardens. Yet in every home, in every street, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the threat looming above. Families whispered in hushed tones about the Vokari, sharing rumors about what the attackers would do if they reached Sif. Scholars wrote feverishly, attempting to understand their adversaries, while engineers worked tirelessly to reinforce the city's floating platforms. There was a sense that every moment counted, that time was slipping away. And yet the Zillerans clung to their traditions, their love for beauty, knowledge, and peace, even in the face of uncertainty. As the sun set over the crystal forests, casting long, colorful shadows over the landscape, a silent question hung over the planet. Who would come if the Zillerans cried out for help? Their history had taught them that the galaxy often ignored the weak, that politics and fear often outweighed morality. Yet there was still hope, fragile as it was, that someone or something would answer when no one else would. It was a hope rooted not in expectation, but in the understanding that courage and honor sometimes came from the most unexpected places. Little did the Zillerans know, the universe had already begun to answer that question, far beyond the reaches of their bright, peaceful skies. This was the stage, the calm before the storm. The Zillerans, serene, intelligent, and untested in true conflict, were about to face a threat that would challenge everything they believed about survival, strength, and hope. And somewhere in the darkness of space, the Deathworlders, unseen, mysterious, and formidable, were beginning to take notice. The calm that had long defined Zelaria was shattered suddenly, though not immediately. At first, the Zillerans noticed unusual activity at the edges of their star system. Strange signals appeared on long-range scanners, faint but persistent, like whispers in the void. Scientists and analysts tried to interpret them, but the readings were unlike anything they had seen before. They weren't random cosmic noise, they were organized, coordinated, and purposeful. Initially, some dismissed the signs, assuming they were anomalies from distant stars or old debris. But the truth became undeniable when the Vokari ships appeared in their system, enormous and intimidating, moving with terrifying speed and precision. The peaceful civilization, which had never known true warfare, suddenly realized the threat was real, immediate, and unstoppable by normal means. The first attacks were small but devastating. Reconnaissance drones were destroyed before they could even relay information back to the Zilleran command. Outlying settlements on distant platforms and moons were obliterated without warning, leaving only smoldering ruins. The Zillerans, whose lives had been built around harmony and knowledge, were forced to confront the brutal reality that their technology, advanced as it was for exploration and energy management, was woefully inadequate for war. Panic began to spread among the population. Citizens who had never imagined leaving their homes were suddenly evacuating entire cities, trying to escape a force that could strike anywhere, at any time. Families clung to one another, fearful of what might come next. Children too young to understand the scale of the danger were confused and frightened by the sudden chaos in a world that had always seemed safe. In response, the Zilleran Council convened emergency meetings. The leaders debated furiously, trying to figure out what to do. They had always relied on diplomacy, treaties, and alliances to maintain peace. Now, faced with a deadly enemy, they realized that all their efforts had been in vain. Messages of desperation were sent to every known ally in the galaxy, begging for assistance. They reached out to neighboring civilizations, some more technologically advanced than the Zillerans, hoping that friendships and previous trade agreements would inspire aid. Yet the responses were almost uniformly disappointing. Some claimed they were too busy defending their own territories. Others argued that helping the Zillerans could provoke the Vokari and bring destruction to their own worlds. A few asked for impossible payment or resources in exchange for protection, treating the Zillerans as a commodity rather than a species in distress. One by one, the doors closed on hope, leaving the Zillerans isolated and vulnerable. The weight of this rejection fell heavily on Zilleran society. Scholars and philosophers questioned everything they had believed. For generations they had assumed that intelligence, morality, and diplomacy were enough to ensure survival. Now confronted by the cold, harsh reality of the galaxy, they were forced to reconsider. Leaders argued late into the night, trying to find solutions that would allow their people to survive without descending into panic. Engineers and scientists worked frantically, converting civilian ships into makeshift defense vessels, retrofitting energy shields, and attempting to adapt exploration technology for combat. Yet the progress was slow, and the Volcari fleet was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. Meanwhile, fear and anxiety gripped the population. Citizens watched the sky for signs of the enemy. Families clutched one another as alerts rang across the floating cities, warning of incoming attacks. The once peaceful plazas and gardens now stood empty, replaced by hastily constructed shelters and defensive positions. Even as Zillerans attempted to maintain some semblance of normalcy, the psychological strain was immense. People were not accustomed to violence, and the sudden threat of total annihilation caused arguments, despair, and confusion to spread almost as quickly as the Volcari forces themselves. The cultural identity of a species built on peace and intellectual pursuit was being tested to its limits. The Volcari, in contrast, were methodical and ruthless. They did not simply attack, they studied their targets, learned their weaknesses, and struck where it would cause the most fear and destruction. Their approach was to demoralize as much as to destroy. The first direct encounters between Zilleran patrol ships and Volcari vessels ended disastrously. The Volcari ships were heavily armed, faster, and far more experienced in combat. Entire fleets of Zilleran defenders were decimated in moments, leaving survivors to flee or surrender. Reports of these battles spread rapidly through Zilleran communication networks, and the sense of hopelessness deepened. Every failed defense seemed to highlight the magnitude of their disadvantage. The Zillerans had never encountered such unrelenting aggression before. Their peaceful philosophy offered no guidance on how to survive in a war where mercy was absent. Desperation forced Zillerans to make difficult decisions. Families were evacuated to hidden locations beneath the oceans or in deep underground facilities, places the Volcari might overlook but which could sustain life if the planet's surface was destroyed. Civilians were trained in basic defense tactics, though most had never held a weapon. Scientists adapted experimental energy devices for use as weapons, hoping that ingenuity might offset their disadvantage in strength and numbers. The entire civilization mobilized in ways they had never anticipated, driven by a collective desire to survive. Yet, even as they prepared, the Zillerans were painfully aware that these measures might only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. It was during this dark time that small flickers of hope began to appear, though they were subtle and unassuming at first. Scouts detected unknown signals moving through the outer regions of space. These signals were unlike anything the Zillerans had encountered. They were not aggressive, but they were powerful, precise, and purposeful. Some suggested they might be a natural phenomenon, like bursts of radiation from distant stars. Others thought perhaps another civilization had detected the Volcari and intended to intervene. Still, there was no way to know for certain. The uncertainty caused anxiety, but also a faint spark of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, help might arrive. Despite these small signals, the situation continued to worsen. The Volcari tightened their grip on nearby star systems, conquering settlements that might have served as allies or sources of support. Refugees from these attacks began arriving on Zelaria, bringing with them stories of devastation, loss, and terror. These accounts only strengthened the sense of urgency. Zilleran leaders realized that they could not rely on diplomacy or hope alone. Action was necessary. Yet their attempts to prepare for combat were hampered by inexperience, limited resources, and the knowledge that any confrontation would be deadly. Every strategy was weighed with the knowledge that failure meant the destruction of their civilization. Even as fear mounted, the Zillerans began to demonstrate remarkable resilience. They adapted to their new reality with creativity and determination. Scholars who had spent their lives studying philosophy turned their minds to tactics. Engineers and scientists who had focused on exploration shifted to inventing new ways to defend their people. Families supported one another, providing emotional strength in a time of fear and uncertainty. The civilization that had been defined by peace and intellectual achievement now discovered an inner strength born from the need to survive. It was not enough to hope for rescue, they had to prepare for the possibility that no one would come. And yet, the universe had other plans. While the Zillerans scrambled to defend themselves and awaited aid from distant civilizations that had so far refused to respond, the mysterious Deathworlder fleet began to move. These were beings of legendary resilience and skill, accustomed to survival in conditions that would destroy most lifeforms. Unlike the other civilizations, the Deathworlders did not hesitate or debate. They did not weigh risk against reward. They acted according to a code of honor and a recognition of potential. Somewhere far beyond the Zillerans' knowledge, they had detected the distress signals and were beginning their journey. The Zillerans, unaware of this, continued to prepare as best they could. their hope wavering but never extinguished. The challenge that faced the Zillerans in these weeks and months was not simply physical. It was psychological and cultural as well. They had to confront the limits of their philosophy, the fragility of their peace, and the harsh truth that the galaxy did not care about ideals or morality. They were forced to reconcile their identity as a gentle, intelligent civilization with the brutal reality of survival against an overwhelmingly powerful enemy. It was a test unlike any they had faced before, and every decision they made carried weighty consequences for the lives of millions. Through it all, the Zillerans' determination grew. They organized, innovated, and persevered, even as the Vokari's shadow grew closer. Families, leaders, scholars, and engineers worked side by side, each contributing in whatever way they could to the survival of their world. And though they had not yet seen the Deathworlders or understood that rescue was on the way, they held on to the fragile hope that the galaxy might not be entirely indifferent. In this period of rising challenge, the Zillerans learned resilience, resourcefulness, and courage, setting the stage for the moment when outside intervention would arrive and alter the course of their history forever. The calm before the storm had vanished completely. For the Zillerans, what had started as distant signs of danger now erupted into a full-blown crisis. The Vokari fleet, vast and merciless, moved into orbit around Zelaria with terrifying precision. From the moment their first warships appeared in the planet's skies, panic escalated into fear that gripped every corner of the civilization. Citizens watched from floating platforms, their eyes wide as colossal ships, bristling with weapons and shielded by impenetrable armor, darkened the bright horizon. The once serene skies of Zelaria, which reflected twin suns and the sparkling oceans below, were now dominated by a fleet that radiated nothing but destruction. Families huddled in their homes, elders whispered prayers, and even the bravest members of the council found themselves shaken by the sheer magnitude of the threat. The Zillerans had prepared as best they could. Their fleets of exploratory vessels had been hastily converted into defensive units. Energy shields had been strengthened, and basic combat drills had been taught to civilians. Yet no matter how quickly they acted, it became painfully clear that their efforts were not enough. The Vokari had fought countless wars, and every move the Zillerans made was anticipated and countered. Early skirmishes were devastating. Defensive energy grids that protected the outer platforms were torn apart within minutes. Small defensive ships were obliterated almost immediately. Even the most ingenious Zilleran strategies, carefully designed formations, diversionary tactics, and experimental weaponry failed to slow the Vokari's advance. Each loss was measured not just in destroyed ships, but in the psychological toll it inflicted on a people unaccustomed to seeing their world under siege. Amid this chaos, the Zillerans faced not only physical attacks but the fear of the unknown. Every Vokari strike was unpredictable and overwhelming. The invaders were not only skilled tacticians but also unyielding in their brutality. Where Zillerans had always believed that intelligence and careful planning could outmatch strength, they now discovered that sheer aggression could override even the most sophisticated strategies. Families were forced to evacuate from cities that had stood for centuries. Schoolchildren, once studying philosophy and the arts, were hurried into shelters while adults manned defensive stations, often improvising with weapons they had never intended to use. The planet itself seemed to tremble under the weight of approaching doom, as if nature itself recognized the severity of the threat. Even as the Vokari pressed their advantage, hope arrived in the most unexpected form. Far beyond Zelaria, in the dark reaches of uncharted space, the Deathworlder fleet appeared. Unlike other civilizations, they did not hesitate or negotiate. They did not send ambassadors or demand payment. They simply arrived. Massive, heavily armored ships dropped out of warp space, cutting through the darkness with purpose. The Zillerans, still unaware of their presence, first noticed anomalies on their scanners' massive energy signatures, moving faster than anything they had previously recorded. It took time for them to realize that help was on the way, but that realization alone ignited a spark of hope among the leaders and people alike. The first contact occurred when a small squadron of Deathworlder strike ships descended into the outer orbit of Zelaria. The Vokari, confident and arrogant, did not anticipate this intervention. Their overconfidence became their weakness. The Deathworlders were unlike anything the Vokari had faced. Their ships were built to endure extreme conditions, heavily armored and armed with advanced weaponry designed for maximum efficiency and minimal waste. They did not simply attack. They strategized with brutal intelligence, exploiting every weakness in the Vokari formation. The initial clashes were fierce, and the shock on both sides was palpable. Vokari commanders, accustomed to subjugating civilizations that relied on diplomacy rather than combat, found themselves facing an enemy who could outmaneuver them in ways they had not considered. As the battle escalated, the Zillerans watched from their planet, both terrified and amazed. The skies above were filled with explosions, streaks of energy, and ships maneuvering with precision and coordination beyond anything the Zillerans could have imagined. The Deathworlders moved with a terrifying grace, striking hard, withdrawing, and striking again, wearing down the Vokari fleet through strategy and sheer ferocity. It was not merely a clash of weapons but a demonstration of resilience, courage, and mastery of war by beings who thrived in the harshest conditions. The Zillerans could only watch, learning in awe how determination and skill could overcome overwhelming odds. At the height of the conflict, a critical moment arose that would determine the fate of Zil. The Valkyrie flagship, a colossal vessel that coordinated the enemy fleet, had positioned itself to deliver a devastating blow that could cripple the planet's defenses entirely. Its arrival signaled what appeared to be the endgame. The Zillaran fleet, despite all efforts, was barely holding its own. The outer defense platforms were damaged, and panic threatened to spread across the population below. The streets were empty, shelters filled, and even the council members, normally composed, faced the terrifying reality that their world could be lost in hours. It was at this moment that the Deathworlders executed a daring plan. A specialized strike team, consisting of their most skilled pilots and commandos, infiltrated the Valkyrie flagship. This operation was nearly suicidal by conventional standards. The ship's defenses were formidable, and even the slightest mistake would result in total annihilation. Yet the Deathworlders thrived in situations where others would falter. They moved with precision, exploiting weaknesses that only their experience in survival on deadly worlds could teach them to recognize. Within moments, the strike team penetrated critical areas of the Valkyrie flagship, sabotaging systems that coordinated the enemy fleet's attack and creating confusion among the invaders. The result was immediate and dramatic. The Valkyrie fleet, now lacking direction and coordination, became vulnerable to counterattacks. The Deathworlders, executing perfectly timed maneuvers, surrounded and struck key targets with devastating efficiency. What had seemed like an inevitable defeat turned into a turning point. The Valkyrie, once confident in their ability to crush Zelaria, found themselves retreating in disarray. Explosions lit up space, massive vessels broke apart, and the invaders were forced to reconsider their approach. The planet below, still under threat, began to breathe a cautious sigh of relief. For the first time since the invasion began, the Zillerans dared to hope that survival was possible. Even amidst victory, the battle was brutal. Both the Deathworlders and the Valkyrie suffered heavy losses, and the skies of Zelaria were littered with the remnants of destroyed ships. The sheer intensity of the conflict left a lasting impression on the Zillerans, who had never witnessed warfare on such a scale. Civilians, peering through reinforced observation platforms, could barely comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. The Deathworlders had not only fought with unmatched skill but had also demonstrated a strategic intelligence that turned the tide of war at the most critical moment. They had arrived not as conquerors, but as saviors, ruthless in combat, yet disciplined and precise, ensuring that as much of Zelaria as possible remained intact. On the aftermath of the infiltration of the Valkyrie flagship, the remaining enemy forces began to scatter. Smaller Valkyrie ships attempted to regroup, but the coordinated counterattacks from the Deathworlders prevented them from forming an effective formation. For the first time, the Zillerans saw the enemy retreat in fear rather than advancing with confidence. Hope, fragile but growing, began to spread across the planet. Citizens emerged cautiously from shelters, looking toward the skies with awe. Leaders, previously paralyzed by indecision, began to coordinate emergency recovery efforts. Inspired by the display of courage and tactical brilliance above, the critical moment of escalation was not just the physical turning point of battle. It was also a psychological shift. The Zillerans, who had feared total annihilation, witnessed firsthand that the seemingly impossible could be achieved when skill, courage, and determination converged. Their understanding of the galaxy expanded, as they realized that help could come from unexpected sources. The Deathworlders, a mysterious and formidable species, had entered the conflict not for glory or gain, but because they recognized value in defending those who could not defend themselves. For the Zillerans, this was a revelation. The universe, while harsh and indifferent at times, was not entirely devoid of allies. By the end of this phase of the conflict, the Valkyrie were forced to retreat, and the Zillerans were left stunned and grateful. The Deathworlders hovered in orbit, repairing damage and maintaining a defensive perimeter, ensuring that the threat of another immediate attack was minimized. The planet, while scarred by battle, had survived. For the first time in generations, the Zillerans understood the true meaning of survival under fire, and they began to see that their civilization's peaceful nature did not make them weak. It made them worth defending in the eyes of those who valued courage, resilience, and honor. This period, the critical moment of escalation, defined the Zillerans' understanding of conflict, heroism, and the unpredictable nature of the galaxy. It was a time of fear, chaos, and destruction, but it was also a moment where hope emerged against all odds. The Deathworlders, through their skill, precision, and daring, had not only saved the planet but had also reshaped the Zillerans' understanding of survival and courage. In witnessing such an extraordinary intervention, the Zillerans began to prepare themselves not only to rebuild, but to engage with the universe with a new awareness of both danger and possibility. The battle that had consumed Zelaria and its skies for what felt like endless hours finally began to wind down. The Valkyrie, shattered and disorganized from the daring tactics of the Deathworlder fleet, retreated into the darkness of space, leaving the planet battered but not broken. For the Zillerans, it was a moment of surreal relief. The panic that had gripped their cities, the fear that had shadowed every street, every home, and every heart, began to ebb. Citizens, still trembling from hours of chaos, cautiously emerged from shelters to gaze at the sky. The once serenest horizon, once dominated by enemy ships, was now filled with the formidable yet controlled presence of the Deathworlder fleet, maintaining a protective perimeter above the planet. The sight was both intimidating and comforting, reminder that the galaxy could be both dangerous and, surprisingly, merciful. In the immediate aftermath, the first challenge was recovery. Zelaria had suffered significant damage. The floating platforms that held the cities had sustained structural damage. Energy conduits and communication systems were partially destroyed, and the outer defense grids were compromised. Rescue operations began immediately, coordinated by a combination of Zillaran leaders and the Deathworlder forces. The Deathworlders, despite their fearsome reputation in battle, moved with discipline and precision. They helped evacuate the most severely affected areas, repaired critical infrastructure, and stabilized energy systems to prevent further disasters. Their efficiency was astonishing to the Zillerans, who had never seen beings combine such power with careful, methodical action. The citizens were initially wary. Stories of the Deathworlders' deadly prowess were widespread, and many expected that even in victory, the aliens might demand some form of tribute or compensation. Yet, what the Zillerans experienced was entirely different. The Deathworlders acted with restraint and purpose. They did not loot or dominate. They repaired, protected, and guided. Civilians, slowly gaining confidence, began to assist in rebuilding efforts, learning from the aliens' techniques and strategies. There was a shared sense of determination, an understanding that survival required cooperation, courage, and adaptation. For the Zillerans, this was a profound lesson. Strength could be wielded responsibly, and those who fought with power could also act with honor. The political and social leaders of Zelaria faced their own challenges during this period. They had to balance immediate recovery with longer-term planning, ensuring that the planet could withstand future threats while preserving its culture, identity, and values. Council chambers, once filled with debate about diplomacy and philosophy, were now buzzing with discussion about defense, infrastructure, and resource allocation. Yet even in these urgent conversations, the Zillerans remembered the lessons of the battle. They had seen firsthand how preparation, resilience, and decisive action could save their civilization. While they valued peace, they understood now that they needed to cultivate the ability to defend themselves in a universe that did not always honor diplomacy. Amid the reconstruction efforts, a sense of awe and gratitude toward the Deathworlders began to take root. The aliens' actions were not motivated by reward or recognition. They acted according to their own code of honor. Zillaran scholars and leaders observed this with fascination. The Deathworlders' discipline and efficiency were extraordinary. But what struck the Zillerans most was the combination of formidable strength with moral purpose. These were beings who had survived in the harshest environments, endured countless battles, and yet could act with calculated fairness and restraint. It challenged the Zillerans' understanding of what it meant to be powerful. Strength, they realized, was not only in physical or technological might, it was also in the capacity to use that power wisely and ethically. The wounded were a priority. Hospitals, often designed for routine medical care rather than the aftermath of war, were quickly overwhelmed. The Deathworlders helped set up emergency treatment centers, stabilizing injured citizens and training Zillaran medics in rapid response techniques. This was not a simple matter of tending to physical injuries. The psychological trauma was immense. Many had witnessed family members, friends, and colleagues in danger, and the shock of near-total annihilation left deep emotional scars. Psychologists and counselors, working alongside the Deathworlders, began programs to help citizens process fear, grief, and relief. Stories of bravery emerged from all corners of society: children who guided younger siblings to safety, scientists who risked exposure to damage zones to save critical data, and families who coordinated makeshift shelters under extreme pressure. The Zillerans, who had always valued intellect and culture, were now discovering the resilience of spirit that could sustain them through calamity. During this time, the Zillerans began to study the Deathworlders closely. Ships, weapons, and tactics that had seemed invincible during battle were now carefully examined for understanding and potential future use. Scholars, engineers, and strategists took notes, learning techniques that could be adapted to Zillaran technology. Observing the precision and coordination of the Deathworlders inspired a new wave of innovation. Zillaran inventors began working on defensive systems and energy weapons that could integrate some of the methods used by the fleet, though adapted to their peaceful culture. This period of observation and learning would ultimately strengthen Zelaria for generations to come, creating a legacy born from the combination of survival, gratitude, and education. The relationship between the Zillerans and the Deathworlders, though brief, was transformative. While the Deathworlders did not linger long, they had other missions. Other systems to monitor and protect. Their presence left an indelible mark. They had arrived at the critical moment, intervened with decisive force, and then allowed the Zillerans to take control of their own recovery. In doing so, they imparted not just physical protection but a deeper understanding that courage, preparation, and collaboration could overcome even the most overwhelming threats. For the Zillarans, who had lived in peace and assumed that morality alone could protect them, it was a revelation. As the immediate dangers passed, the planet began to return to normalcy, though scars remained. Cities bore marks of destruction and repair, and memorials were constructed to honor those lost in the conflict. The experience had reshaped the cultural consciousness of the Zillarans. Their art, literature, and music began to reflect the dual realities of fear and hope, destruction and survival, vulnerability and resilience. Children born after the attack would grow up hearing tales not just of danger, but of the remarkable intervention that saved their world. These stories became part of the Zillaran identity, reinforcing values of courage, vigilance, and the importance of alliances formed not out of obligation but respect and mutual recognition. In the councils and public forums, discussions emerged about the galaxy beyond Zillaran. Leaders realized that isolation was no longer viable. The universe was filled with civilizations that might act selfishly, aggressively, or indifferently, just as the Volcari had demonstrated. Yet they also recognized that alliances could form in unexpected ways, and that strength combined with honor could attract allies capable of turning the tide in moments of extreme crisis. The Deathworlders became an example, a benchmark for understanding how civilization could interact with the galaxy. Observing them, the Zillarans learned lessons not just about survival but about moral courage, the ability to act decisively while respecting life and fairness. As weeks turned into months, Zalaria's recovery accelerated. Infrastructure was rebuilt, energy grids restored, and the population slowly returned to its daily routines. Commerce, once disrupted by fear, began to resume. Cultural and scientific activities recommenced, though now infused with a new awareness of fragility and the need for preparedness. The Zillarans, while relieved, remained vigilant. They had survived an unprecedented threat and had been saved by forces they had never imagined could exist. The lesson was clear. The galaxy was vast, dangerous, and unpredictable, and survival required both ingenuity and courage. Above all, the experience instilled a profound sense of gratitude and humility. The Zillarans recognized that survival was never guaranteed, and that the intervention of the Deathworlders had not been owed, purchased, or demanded. It had been given freely, guided by principles and respect rather than politics or gain. For a civilization that had long relied on diplomacy and intellectual prowess, this was a transformative insight. The Zillarans realized that true strength lay not only in the capacity to defend or negotiate but in the willingness to act decisively when moral imperatives demanded it. In the end, the resolution of the crisis brought a mixture of relief, reflection, and forward-looking determination. Zalaria had survived, scarred but unbroken. Its people had faced unimaginable fear and uncertainty and had emerged more resilient, resourceful, and united than ever before. The Deathworlders, having completed their intervention, departed silently, leaving behind a planet forever changed not just in infrastructure or technology, but in spirit, understanding, and resolve. The Zillarans now possessed both the knowledge and the experience to face future threats. Inspired by a vivid example of courage and honor that had appeared at their darkest hour, this resolution phase marked the end of immediate conflict, but it also sowed seeds for the future, a civilization stronger in strategy, wiser in alliances, and more aware of the dual nature of the galaxy, a place of both danger and unexpected allies. The Zillarans had learned a timeless lesson, that survival, honor, and courage often arrive together, and sometimes from the most unexpected corners of the universe. The days after the Volcari retreat and the Deathworlder intervention were filled with a strange mix of relief, exhaustion, and reflection for the Zillarans. Life on Zalaria slowly began to return to normal, but it was a new normal one shaped by the memory of near destruction, the courage displayed in the skies above, and the lessons learned during a battle they had never imagined they would face. People returned to their homes cautiously, repairing damage and tending to loved ones who had been injured or traumatized. Streets once filled with activity had been quieted by fear, but now, as the immediate threat passed, a sense of cautious hope began to spread. Citizens rebuilt homes, reopened schools, and restored marketplaces, determined to reclaim the life that had been threatened. The survivors carried with them stories that would become the foundation of Zillaran culture for generations. Children spoke of the mysterious, powerful fleet that had appeared at the perfect moment, turning fear into relief. Parents shared tales of courage and resilience, recounting how neighbors, friends, and even strangers had helped one another in ways they had never expected. The story of the Deathworlders in particular became central to these narratives. They were not just warriors. They were disciplined, intelligent, and, most importantly, guided by a moral code that had saved an entire civilization. The Zillarans, who had long valued knowledge, art, and philosophy above all else, began to understand that courage and honor could exist alongside intelligence and creativity, forming a combination capable of protecting life itself. The leadership of Zalaria took these lessons to heart. Council members and advisors convened to evaluate not only the damage and repairs, but also the philosophical, implications of what had occurred. The civilization that had relied on diplomacy and alliances realized that the galaxy was not a safe place, and that even the best-intentioned treaties could fail when confronted with overwhelming force. They began to implement changes, new defense protocols, emergency response systems, and educational programs that combined knowledge with practical survival skills. Citizens were taught that vigilance and preparation were essential, but also that courage and cooperation were just as critical. The experience had reshaped their approach to governance and society, creating a culture that valued both intellect and strength. On the weeks and months that followed, the Zillerans undertook extensive rebuilding projects. The floating cities that had been damaged during the battle were reconstructed with improved design, incorporating lessons learned from the Deathworlder's tactics. Energy systems were upgraded, defensive grids reinforced, and transportation networks restored. Scientists and engineers collaborated more closely than ever before, developing innovations that merged Zilleran ingenuity with the practical strategies observed from the Deathworlders. The society that had once focused almost exclusively on art, knowledge, and diplomacy now embraced resilience and adaptability as core values. The blending of these qualities created a civilization more prepared for the dangers of the galaxy without losing its identity. The psychological impact of the battle was profound. The Zillerans had experienced fear, despair, and the threat of annihilation, but they had also witnessed extraordinary courage and unexpected kindness. Many families lost members, and every citizen carried the memory of what had nearly been lost. At the same time, the intervention of the Deathworlders inspired a renewed sense of hope and possibility. People began to understand that while the universe could be indifferent or hostile, it could also harbor allies capable of extraordinary acts. This understanding reshaped the Zillerans' collective mindset. They were no longer a civilization living in idealistic isolation, but one aware of the harsh realities of the galaxy and the potential for unexpected support. The Zillerans also reflected on the nature of power and responsibility. Watching the Deathworlders operate had been an eye-opening experience. These were beings who could destroy entire fleets with ease, yet they chose to act with precision, restraint, and moral purpose. They demonstrated that true strength was not measured solely in power or fear, but in the ability to protect, to act decisively, and to uphold a code of honor even in the chaos of war. For the Zillerans, this lesson was invaluable. They realized that power, whether technological, intellectual, or physical, carried a responsibility to be used wisely. The example of the Deathworlders became a model for how they hoped to conduct themselves in future. When encounters with other civilizations and cultural expression began to reflect the events of the battle and its aftermath, art, literature, music, and storytelling all incorporated themes of courage, resilience, and the lessons learned from the Deathworlders' intervention. Children learned about the battle not just as a historical event but as a story of moral strength, strategy, and bravery. Scholars wrote analyses of the tactical brilliance demonstrated by the Deathworlders, integrating these insights into Zilleran education and philosophy. The collective memory of the crisis became a tool for teaching future generations the importance of preparation, courage, and moral integrity in a universe where danger could arrive without warning. Diplomacy and interstellar relations were also transformed. The Zillerans realized that many civilizations in the galaxy were indifferent or opportunistic, but that alliances could be formed in unexpected ways. The intervention had come not from political necessity or trade agreements, but from a recognition of courage and potential. This understanding shifted the way the Zillerans approached communication with other species. They became more discerning, learning to recognize those capable of honor and courage while remaining cautious of those driven purely by self. In this way, the experience with the Deathworlders not only saved their civilization but also fundamentally altered their approach to interstellar relations. At the same time, gratitude toward the Deathworlders was profound. They had entered the battle without promise of reward, fought with skill and precision, and departed once their task was complete. Zilleran leaders and citizens alike were awed by this combination of power, discipline, and moral clarity. Monuments were erected, stories were written, and songs composed in honor of the fleet. The Deathworlders became both heroes and a symbol of what the Zillerans aspired to understand about strength and responsibility. Their actions had not only saved lives, but had also provided a model for how a civilization could act with integrity while wielding formidable power. Life on Zelaria began to stabilize, but the memory of the crisis remained vivid. Daily routines returned, yet the lessons of vigilance, preparedness, and resilience were deeply ingrained. Citizens continued to repair, rebuild, and innovate, motivated by both gratitude and the desire to ensure their civilization would never again face such vulnerability unprepared. The experience had forged a stronger, wiser Zilleran society, one that had confronted fear, survived chaos, and emerged with a renewed sense of purpose and identity. The reflection extended beyond the immediate aftermath of battle. Leaders, scholars, and citizens contemplated the nature of heroism and courage, recognizing that it was not only physical ability that mattered but also moral judgment and the willingness to act in defense of others. The Deathworlders, as distant and enigmatic as they were, had demonstrated this truth on a cosmic scale. Their intervention became a philosophical and practical lesson, inspiring the Zillarans to integrate these ideals into governance, culture, and education. They understood that the universe was vast and unpredictable, but that knowledge, courage, and ethical action could shape outcomes even against overwhelming odds over time. Zelaria became stronger, more resilient, and more prepared. The events of the battle and the Deathworlders' intervention became the defining moment of the civilization, shaping policies, culture, and philosophy for generations. The Zillarans had learned that survival required not only intelligence and diplomacy but also courage, adaptability, and the recognition that allies might come from the most unexpected places. They had witnessed firsthand that honor and skill could turn the tide of disaster, and that even in the darkest moments, hope and action could prevail. Even as life normalized, the Zillarans maintained a vigilant eye on the stars. They continued to train, innovate, and strengthen their defenses, knowing that threats like the Vokari could return or that new dangers could arise from other parts of the galaxy. Yet they also carried the knowledge that the universe held beings capable of extraordinary courage and honor, and that in times of need, help could come from unexpected corners. This dual understanding of danger and hope became a cornerstone of Zillaran identity. Ultimately, the aftermath of the battle was more than a period of recovery. It was a time of profound transformation. The Zillarans had faced annihilation, witnessed unparalleled courage, and learned lessons that reshaped their civilization. Their culture, governance, and philosophy evolved to embrace both resilience and honor, knowledge and courage. They became a civilization that could defend itself, value moral integrity, and recognize the extraordinary potential in allies and individuals alike. The events left a lasting imprint, a story to be told for generations, and a model for how even the most peaceful societies could survive and thrive in a universe full of uncertainty. And though the Deathworlders eventually departed, leaving no promise of return, their impact endured. Zillarans remembered not just the battle but the lesson that courage, honor, and skill, combined with decisiveness and moral clarity, could change the fate of worlds. This understanding became the legacy of that fateful encounter, a reminder that even in the vast, dangerous galaxy, hope, integrity, and strength could prevail when least expected. It shaped not just the present but the future of Zelaria, leaving the civilization wiser, stronger, and more aware of the balance between vulnerability and resilience, fear and courage, despair and hope.